Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Argo Visa's live webinar today. We're going to be focusing on student visa interview, mainly talking about the spring intake, but there should be some tips and advice and insights that will help all of you, no matter what type of visa you're applying for, where you're applying, but this will be a particularly good one for students. Just want to get out there and say, sorry, we're running a few minutes late, always run into some technical difficulties, but we're here and we'll be ready to answer some of your questions and go through some of your top tips and for passing the student visa interview. Today, we're very excited to have Maggie here. She's a former consular officer with over 10 years of experience. Maggie, do you want to introduce yourself to everybody that's joined us today?
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Maggie. Like Davis said, I'm a former U.S. visa officer. I worked for the U.S. State Department for over 11 years as a consular officer, visa officer. During that time, I had postings in India at the American Consulate in Mumbai. I also worked in Europe at the American Embassy in Poland. I worked in Canada at the American Consulate in Toronto, and also I worked in Washington, D.C., which is the headquarters of the State Department. All in all, I have adjudicated or made decisions on over 25,000 U.S. visa applications, and that was across a range of different categories, non-immigrant, immigrant visas, quite a lot of student visas. So I'm looking forward to speaking to you all today. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Maggie. And also, I always am impressed by how many interviews all of our officers have done during their time at the State Department, which is just another reason why we always recommend, working with one of our officers or an expert at Argo rather than some other places. You may have had a friend that's gone to one interview before. You've heard of a source that's been to 4 interviews, or everything's a little bit cobbled together with personal experiences, where all of our officers have done tens of thousands of visa interviews. So their amount of knowledge about all the different directions a visa interview can go is almost endless, especially across our entire team. They've done over 1 million visa interviews, which is really an insane number of interviews and repetitions that we have amongst our team. So Maggie, let's just dive in and start with kind of a broad question. And if you guys have questions, a few housekeeping items, go ahead and add them in the chat. You're welcome to do so. Please only add your question once. If you continue to add your question multiple times, we will not answer it because it clogs up the chat and it prevents us from seeing what other people are asking. So please just send your question once. We will have time for questions. We'll get to questions and then we'll go from there. So Maggie, let's just start super high level. How do you know if you're ready for your student visa interview? How will a student know if they're ready to go in for their interview?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the first things to think about is, are you ready to talk about your qualifications for the student visa? So, broadly speaking, we think about 3 things. We think about you need to demonstrate to the visa officer that you are qualified. Secondly, you need to demonstrate that you have the financial resources at your disposal to cover the cost of your education. And secondly, you need to demonstrate that you will return to your home country, so you do have that plan in place. So when you are ready to articulate, ready to communicate those items, then broadly speaking, you should be ready for your student visa interview.
Awesome. Okay, that is helpful to have you break down kind of those 3 components. Of course, it's always a little bit simpler, but it always sounds a little bit simpler than it is in practice, because then you have a lot of factors in your case that make up all of your qualifications, your communication, that sort of thing. So what do you feel like when you were a visa officer, especially making decisions on student visas, were the biggest mistakes you saw students making?
Yeah, I saw quite a few. You really need to project that confidence to the visa officer. So, you need to come in and be prepared, be ready to talk about yourself, be ready to talk about your passion for your studies, especially with the student visa. You really need to work on your communication skills, because if you're not able to communicate well to the visa officer, if you haven't done that preparation ahead of time, then I think it can be really challenging for the visa officer to be able to approve you, because they just won't know if you're qualified if you don't tell them. So I think having that confidence, again, having those communication skills, knowing your strengths and your weaknesses. And I think that's something that really that we at Argo Visa can help out with, because we can give you that personalized service in terms of identifying what are your strengths of your case, what are your weaknesses, and how can you package yourself in a way that really highlights your strengths and maybe mitigate some of your weaknesses or overcomes those in a way that's palatable to the visa officer. So, being ready with all those things, that's so important. I think prepare and practice. And that's another part where Argo comes in, because we are able to run mock interviews for folks, sometimes 2 or 3 or more mock interviews, depending on how long you have with us. And people find that these are really, really helpful, because it takes away some of the nerves that people have. People get so nervous ahead of their visa interview, which is totally understandable. But if you're able to run a very realistic mock interview with an officer, a former visa officer from Argo, then we can help you to understand how to best answer these questions, get those nerves out of the way, get that practice in, and then put you in the best possible position for success for your visa interview.
I love the last part you said, put yourself in the best possible position for success at the interview, because I think that's something that people often forget is, these visa officers are people. This is their job. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, Maggie, about how important communication is and connecting with the officer and a person. What do you think that, applicants can do to better connect with the visa officer during their interview?
There are some really good strategies that people can employ. I think that being natural and being yourself and having a conversational style with the officer will really put you in a good position. You don't want to be too formal. You don't want to be too overly deferential. You don't want to keep saying, sir, madam. You don't want to you want to really speak to them at their level. Like if you were speaking to a colleague about something, have that confidence, have that style where you're being natural and you're interacting with them in a very natural way. I think that it's really important. One of the things, going back to your question before, Davis, about, what were some mistakes that I saw when I was a visa officer? So I worked in India for 2 years. I was doing visas all day, every day, interviewing literally hundreds of visa applicants every week. And one thing I saw a lot among Indian students was people would come in with a memorized speech, with a prepared, rehearsed speech. And it was, I think they did it with the best of intentions, because they thought this is the way that I get my visa. This is the way that I don't forget anything. And I'm so nervous, I'm just going to memorize something and just, give them this speech. But I think what that did is it came off as too rehearsed, too prepared, too canned. And it sounded like everybody else. And so if you sound like everyone else and everyone's saying the same thing, then, the visa officer doesn't really understand how you're qualified for the visa. And they think, well, if they just can't have a natural conversation with me about themselves, then, it's really hard for me to tell if they're qualified for the visa. And that often leads to a refusal. So you want to stay away from that pre-prepared, rehearsed speech. You don't want to do that. You do need to practice. You do need to be ready to explain yourself, but, definitely don't start off with a memorized speech. I think that can swiftly lead to a refusal in my experience.
That makes sense. And it does seem kind of like a balance, because we're saying, hey, make sure you practice for your interview, prepare, build confidence by practicing and doing mock interviews. But then at the same time, we really don't recommend memorizing for all the reasons that Maggie just explained. One thing we get asked a lot is people will reach out and say, hey, how do I answer blank question if this is my scenario? So how do I answer about my sponsor if this is my sponsor? Or how do I answer about my school if this is my school? And it isn't as easy as just saying, hey, this is the correct answer or not. Like, Maggie, could you talk a little bit to that idea? And are there correct answers for visa interview questions?
I don't think there are any correct answers here. I think that you have to really approach this in a very personalized way and what is the right thing for your situation. So you're being totally open and honest always with the visa officer. You are telling them about yourself and about why you're qualified. And there are no right or wrong answers. I think that you're giving an overall impression to the visa officer of what you want to do in the US. So if you'd like to study, why do you want to study this subject? Are you passionate about it? Maybe you've done it before. Maybe it's going to lead you to a successful career back in your home country. Really kind of link those things to something tangible in your life. So don't be overly general about things. You need to be personal and specific to you. So there are no correct answers. There's no, if you say this word, then you'll get approved, or if you say this word, then it's automatic disapproval. It's not like that at all. The visa officer is they're looking at your entire situation from, a 360-degree angle. So it's the overall package that you are presenting. And again, that's where I think Argo can really help people here, because we can help you identify, here are your strengths, here are the things to really bring out about yourself. And then, this is how you can package this so that the visa officer understands your qualifications.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. I love what you said about the 360-degree angle, because that's something else we work with a lot of people on, is they come and say, hey, there's this one factor in my case. How much will this matter, or will this matter? And oftentimes it is about the bigger picture. So that's a tip that I would share based on all of the clients we have, is don't just focus on the one aspect. It is a 360-degree view that the officers are looking at, as Maggie said. So look at the full picture. Think about that in your preparation instead of just one small detail. All your details are important because they make the full picture, but have the big picture. So I think that's really helpful. And also to reiterate what Maggie was saying about the correct answers, so she kind of said there's not one correct answer. If you're going to X school, the answer of why you're going to the school is not going to be the same for everybody. It's going to be different. And it needs to be personal, authentic, and kind of goes back to everything Maggie's already been discussing in this conversation about building trust with the officer, being authentic, all of those sorts of things. So to go back to focusing on the student visa interview for a few minutes, do you feel like there's a difference between the spring intake or fall intake when it comes to the visa interview?
I think that in a practical way, not really, because I think the same questions will likely be asked. I think that to delve a little bit deeper, a very traditional timeline for students is to finish their high school or studies or whatever in, say, May or June, and then plan to go off to university that fall, say September, October. So I think that that's a very traditional timeline. So many students will be following that, but a number of them, for whatever reason, maybe for work, or maybe they had to resit some exams or whatever, they will be wanting to start in January. So I think, again, it's about explaining your reasons. If the officer asks you, well, why are you starting, in January at your university studies, you should be prepared to talk about that and talk about why this timeline is right for you. And so, again, it's very personal, and that's going to depend on each person's situation. But I don't think in a practical way it matters so much, as long as you are talking about yourself and your reasons for studying and hitting all those highlights that we discussed before.
Awesome. So to make sure that I understand correctly, you're saying it's not necessarily a red flag or going to have higher refusal rates, but it is one more thing you probably have to explain to the officer or showcase those 3 points in the context of why you're going in the spring.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Great. And, along the same lines is we've seen a lot of people or worked with a lot of people in the last couple of months who maybe got refused this summer for a student visa and are deferring their studies. And now they're going to try again in the spring. What advice would you give to those people who have been refused in the past summer? They're really eager to get to school. They've deferred their admissions. They've been working with their DSOs to figure out a plan. I mean, what advice would you give them if they're going for a visa interview in the coming weeks?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The advice I would give is to think about your previous visa interview and think about maybe what you didn't get a chance to share with the visa officer, or maybe they didn't hear something positive about you, you weren't able to share during the interview for whatever reason. And to think about sharing that with them as soon as you can during your next visa interview. And one context we think about here is what is the change in your situation? That is often something that you want to think about. If you've been refused before and you're going for your next visa interview, what's the big difference that you can show them? Because if there's not a difference, then the visa officer may not be motivated to make a different decision than their colleague did. So you have to really think about, how am I going to overcome this? Maybe the visa officer was concerned about my financial situation. Well, I need to get right in there at the beginning, be very proactive with talking about my finances. I talk to a lot of students who have scholarships, and they don't actually get a chance to, or think of telling the visa officer that during the interview. That's really important information. If you have a scholarship, even a partial scholarship, especially a full scholarship, if you have any sort of financial aid like that from a university, you need to tell the visa officer just as soon as you can, because that can really make a difference in your case. So, things like that maybe you left out of your previous interview, that's the stuff to bring in at the very beginning. Think about what has changed in your situation. Maybe you have a different financial sponsor. Maybe, if something has changed for you, it's important to share that. Or if you feel like they just misunderstood you for some reason, you can go ahead and provide that extra information that might clarify things for them.
Awesome. And it's right, as you were talking, somebody added this into the chat, and I think it's a really important conversation that we talk a lot about in some of our other YouTube videos about going into an interview after a prior refusal. The officer might be asking you, what changes have you made? But they're definitely going to be wondering it, even if they don't directly ask you. One thing that I think is a misconception is some people will say, hey, I got refused last week. If I change my university to this other school, will I get approved next week? Or they don't often know what changes are going to be best for their scenario, or if it's just a matter of presentation or things that really need to change to get an approval. So that's where we do really recommend working with one of our officers. They will listen to your whole past visa interview experience. They can do a full analysis. They can figure out what likely happened, what were the doubts the officer was having, what were the concerns, what did they need to know to give you a better chance in the future. And that's what one of our officers can guide you with and help you kind of address and approach this question. Because in some cases, Maggie, correct me if I'm wrong, you could make too many changes or make the wrong changes, and it not only doesn't help your situation, but could actually hurt your situation if you approach it in the wrong way, where it then becomes a red flag. So it's not always as simple as just changing one thing and then you're going to get approved, but you should have a new plan. So I don't know, Maggie, if you have anything else to add about that topic.
Absolutely. I think everything you said makes a lot of sense. And I think the point about changing your university, we get that question a lot. And, we have to be very cautious here, because you don't want to give the impression to the visa officer that you're sort of just trying to, change your university because you think it'll result in a different answer. I mean, it's not about so much the university, it's about you as an applicant, and what are your reasons for studying, and are you qualified? Do you have all those pieces in place, finances, qualification, return to home country, and are you able to articulate that, tell that to the visa officer? So I think you run the risk of in portraying yourself in a more negative way if you keep switching universities, because then you don't seem very committed to any one place. And so I think you want to be careful about that. So again, something to speak to an Argo officer about if you're wondering, should I change my university?
Awesome. Thanks for sharing the context. So right on the same theme, speaking of university, another thing we hear a lot from applicants, which we touched on a little bit earlier, is someone who reaches out and says, what will the officer think about blank school, or how is blank school? And people fill in whatever school they're going to, or that they plan to go to, that they have an acceptance to. What advice would you give these people that are really wondering about how to present their school at the interview, and how much the school choice does matter during the student visa interview?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think that school choice does matter in the sense that this is what you're going to be talking about. Like, why do you want to go to this school? Why did you choose this school? Why is this degree program the right one for you, et cetera? And I think that, schools, of course, there are ones of varying quality in the United States and indeed around the world. I mean, there's some really top tier schools that, Ivy League, et cetera, and those will be very, very stringent on their admissions. And it's quite easy to explain, well, I got into Harvard to do an MBA, that's pretty self-explanatory, why you'd want to go there. But I think when you go sort of down the range of schools, whether it's a mid-tier or a lower tier ranked school, et cetera, you need to explain to the officer why this is the right choice for you. People do get approved with all different types of schools, but I think that one of the common themes is that they are able to articulate why this is the right school for them. So if they're going for an English language program somewhere, an ESL school maybe, why is this right for them? What is this going to do for their future? What is their plan for after they finish this program? So I think that, school choice can matter. And of course, the reputation of the school, that will factor in too. If a visa officer has heard of your school, that will be something that they may think about. But I think also it's really, really important to focus on that personal reason for the school and what this particular program is going to do for you in your future.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, especially, being able to articulate why you chose that school and explain it in a way that makes sense to the officer. Because if the officer doesn't believe you, or they think that they're not connecting with your explanation, or they maybe have not heard of your school, they might be wondering, why are you making this investment in traveling to the US, or going into debt, or taking these loans to go to this specific school. So the school does play a big part into the F-1 visa as a whole, just because that's their purpose of being there with the school. So I guess for those who are wondering, okay, how is this school? It's not always as simple of a ranking either. The officers don't have a list and say, okay, if you're going to this school, approval or this refusal, or they don't have a rank order list. It's a lot more nuanced than that, and being able to explain and discuss your school at the interview in a way that will connect with the officer. Okay, so let's take some time to go through a few questions that people have been submitting in the chat. And the one other thing about school, just to add as well, is it's one of those factors that makes up the whole picture. So maybe you have other factors in your case that explain the school, or you have a great school, but you have other hurdles in your case that you need to overcome. So that's where the full picture really comes into play too, because the only factor isn't just the school. You have funding, you have past travel, you have your family, all of those components that all make up the interview. So one thing we haven't talked a lot about is about funding, and there's been a handful of questions. I'll just go ahead and put the first one up. Can my married sister fund my education? One thing before you answer, Maggie, one thing that I often like to share with people who ask questions, can I do blank? Oftentimes it's not a matter of can you do it, or is it allowed within the law, or is it an acceptable choice, but it's more about how will the officer perceive it. So, and that always makes it a lot more complicated, because it's no longer a black and white yes or no question of can you do it, but how will it be perceived by the officer. So Maggie, do you want to talk a little bit about this, or just sponsors in general? Because there's a handful of questions about sponsors.
Absolutely. So I'll tackle this with the general, sponsors in general and how they are perceived by visa officers. So if you have someone sponsoring your education, whether it's a relative or a friend or someone like that, I think one of the main things to consider is, where is this money coming from? Does this person work? What is their job? What is their income? What is their motivation for sponsoring you? How did this all come about, that they were able to sponsor your education? We all know that it's quite expensive to study in America, and, tuition is a lot, room and board, all of that. So, the visa officer will want you to be very clear and very convincing about how you have your financial affairs in order for this. So, like with so many students, I think back to my own university days as a student, and, most students in America will be paying for their education through a combination of different funding sources, whether it's a scholarship, a grant, a loan, family members helping, maybe some personal savings, all sorts of combinations of finances. So for you, think about what is your situation and how does this make sense for you? And if someone in your family is helping you, explain that, give them some good details. Think about how you're going to make up the rest of the money. A lot of people take loans for their education. How do you plan to pay back that loan? These are the things that the visa officer will be thinking about. So I think it's not enough to just sort of say, so-and-so is sponsoring my education and just leave it at that. I think you do have to provide more context, more details about how this makes sense for you. And if you are clear and convincing, then the visa officer will look upon that more favorably.
Awesome. And I think this is one piece also where Argo can really help you figure out what's going to be most important for your case. Because if you heard Maggie just talking about the funding, there's a lot of factors that the officer may be considering there, and probably even more depending on the specifics of your individual funding, family member, sources, all of those components. And the interview is short. I mean, Maggie, how long were a lot of your student visa interviews that you conducted in India?
They were generally very short, 2 to 3 minutes at the most. And for people who have been refused previously, probably even shorter. So it is very important to have that plan and be ready to articulate your situation going into the interview.
Exactly. And you can't really guarantee that the officer is going to ask you the question that you want, saying, okay, why is this your sponsor? Or can you tell me about your sponsor? That's not always the best strategy, because then you leave things off. So that's where, again, working with an officer can really help you look at everything and weigh out what's going to be most impactful, what's most important, what are the biggest question marks in the officer's head, and how you go about that strategy. And I think that kind of connects to this question I saw, is how do I put my highlights in the beginning of the interview in a second attempt? I mean, it's great that you're thinking about things in this way and going through. I mean, number one would be figuring out what your best highlights are and making sure you know those highlights. But Maggie, do you want to take a stab at helping with this question?
Absolutely. So, like you said, Davis, it's so great that you're thinking about highlights and, thinking about how to identify those. I think it is a question of being ready to be proactive during your second interview. So if you've been refused before, you need to go in with that plan, and you need to think to yourself, okay, this is what I didn't get a chance to tell the visa officer before, or this is something that I feel like I failed at in my first attempt, but I'm going to tell them this, within the very first question or two. I mean, you really have to be very proactive. So whatever it is they ask you, and they can ask you anything that they want, although there are, typical questions that will be asked at the opening of the visa interview, but you need to be ready to share. And so you are answering that question, but you're also saying, look, I'd like to, clear something up from last time. This is my financial situation, or this is why I want to study at University X, or, this is my job, or whatever it is. But, be very proactive and kind of, you don't want to be passive. You don't want to sort of sit back and just let them ask questions, because then you might not get a chance to share your highlights with them. So you have to think ahead of time, how am I going to tell them? And I'm going to do that very early on in the interview, in case they finish it, finish the interview early, and then, be ready to share that in a very proactive way.
Yeah. And as Maggie was saying too, while you're talking, I remember just a moment ago, you were saying that oftentimes for previously refused applicants, they have an even shorter interview, because the officer already has that knowledge that a different officer refused them, and you have notes in the system. So that also makes it one kind of step harder of something you have to overcome. And to highlight what Maggie was saying, practice does really make a difference here, because everything is easier said than done. So practicing for different scenarios and different types of officers, which is where a lot of our clients really find value out of the mock interviews, because sometimes, our officers will work through you the real potential scenarios. And that's really hard for us to do on a live webinar, as much as it would be great, because they need to know all of your background information, know all about your last interview, make an analysis, all those components to really have the most effective mock interview possible. they'll give you the best attempt, but you can still, practice on your own through your own means. So this is a great question and something I think Maggie and I personally have talked a lot about, which is the DS-160. And I think this is, a great question. So Maggie, do you mind answering, do officers make a decision based on the DS-160?
That's a great question. So the answer is no. They do not make an immediate decision based on your DS-160, which is the visa application. However, this is an important document, and I think that the way you fill it out and the way it's presented can really set the tone for your entire visa interview. So if you turn in a DS-160 that is sort of sloppy, it's got a lot of errors, maybe you forgot to fill out part of it, there's a bunch of spelling errors, you just haven't really taken a lot of time and attention with it, that sends a signal to the visa officer. That tells them that you're not really caring too much about your visa application, you're not taking it seriously, etc. And so I think that can kind of already create a bit of a negative impression at the beginning. So that is one thing that I do share with clients, is that this is an important document. It does set the tone for the visa interview. It's something that the visa officer will look through, and then they may base some of their questions on what they see there. But to, strictly speaking, answer your question, they will not make a decision based on that document, that piece of paper. They do need to ask you some questions. They do need to get a bit more information from you before they make that final decision. But the DS-160 is important, and you should put some time and attention into it. And again, that's something that we here at Argo Visa can help you with.
Awesome. So just to summarize, Maggie, the DS-160 is very important. It's an official U.S. government document. You need to be truthful, accurate, do it correctly, all those components. The officer's not going to make a decision solely on the DS-160, but it will impact your interview and what kind of questions they need answered to get to their decision. Is that kind of a correct summary?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you for the question. I think this is super helpful because people ask about the DS-160 all the time. And if you have questions about the DS-160, you can just email us at hello@argovisa.com. So HELLO@argovisa.com. And that really goes for any of the questions. So if we don't get a chance to answer all of these questions, which we might not, feel free to reach out to us over email. So I think this is another great question, Maggie. How will a previous B1, B2 rejection affect an F1 interview?
Yeah, that's a good question. It definitely factors in the sense that, depending on a number of factors. So, when did the rejection happen for the B1, B2, and what was the reason for your travel at that point? Was it 10 years ago that you applied? Was it 10 days ago, what, all these things that will factor in. Both of those visa categories are subject to the 214B requirement, which is the intending immigrant hurdle that you have to demonstrate that you are not an intending immigrant. So in that way, they could be considered perceived by the visa officer to think about that. So I think it will factor in, but at the same time, the visa officer will also need to ask those questions about your student visa interview, and they will be trying to figure out, are you a genuine student, and do you meet the criteria for the student visa? That's part of their line of questioning. So I think that it does affect it in the sense that it's a part of your visa record, and it's always going to be on your visa record, but I think that there is an opportunity here for applicants with the right preparation to change things in a positive way with the F-1 visa interview, even if they've had previous refusals in any category.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing, Maggie, especially what you said about the non-immigrant visa part, because as Maggie said at the beginning, of the three factors, and if you're joining us now, I would recommend at some point later going back to the beginning of the video so you can learn kind of more about those three basic factors. there is a component about the immigrant intent or non-immigrant intent. And so you're still going to have that hurdle, but there's other components with the F-1 interview and a lot of factors. Another thing I really liked that you said is it's an opportunity. And so as many cons there are to the US visa interview process, one pro could be that it is an opportunity for you. So no matter what you have on paper, whether it's past refusals or your GS-160, you have the opportunity during that visa interview to tell a story or to try to tell your story to the officer. And so that's what we try to really help people with at Argo, or help them strengthen that, because the US visa interview is unlikely to change in the coming time. So it's really about using it as an opportunity to your advantage. Do you have any tips or thoughts on that topic, Maggie?
On how to sort of make that into a positive opportunity, for future visa interviews. Yeah. I think that it's important to, in your preparation, think about how you can present yourself in the best possible way, and how you can maybe address any sort of shortcomings that may have happened in the past, but also present yourself as, this is your situation right now, and this is what you plan to do in the future, and being very clear about articulating those 3 points that I discussed before, which is being a qualified, legitimate student, having your finances in order, and also having that plan to return to your home country so that you are not considered by the visa officer to be an intending immigrant. And I think that really with each new visa interview, this is a fresh opportunity for you. You generally will have a different visa officer, and you will have a fresh opportunity, albeit a very short one. Usually it's a very brief interview after you've been refused, but you will have this fresh opportunity to present yourself. And so I think that's very exciting. And I think that can be a real positive thing. And, I know we here at Argo, we have had success in the past with helping people turn things around after previous refusals, and helping them to think about their situation in a different way, think about maybe what they didn't get a chance to share with the visa officer before, and what they now are going to very proactively share at the beginning. And that can be compelling. And I know me, personally, as a former visa officer, I did overturn previous refusals. I did make different decisions than colleagues when I was presented with new and different information. So it is possible. It can be challenging. I think that having someone to guide you through that process, I think, is important, and putting in that preparation time ahead of time, getting that practice in, but it can be done.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Maggie. Because, on paper, there's going to be all these thoughts the officer will have when they see the case. So during the interview, you have the chance to articulate to the officer, explain to the officer what the context is behind that. So I think this is an interesting question. And I don't know if we've ever touched on it in any of our Argo content before, but does a private or a public university matter? Do officers care about this? Are they thinking about this? What's best, which is probably a whole other question of what's the best type of university for an officer when they're thinking about your case.
Yeah. So I don't think that it matters so much, thinking about that, the type of university. What I'm thinking about is, financially, the sort of financial burden of different types of universities. And of course, private ones can often be much more expensive, although for someone who's a foreigner coming from abroad to study in America, oftentimes public universities are still, the tuition is still going to be high. So I think that it doesn't matter so much what type of university it is in terms of private or public. I think what matters is how you share your own reasons, your own personal situation about why this is the right university for you, why you chose this college, and what this is going to do for you in the future. I think that's the most important thing. I don't think that generally a visa officer is going to fixate on, this is a public university, this is a private, this is small or large, et cetera. I think they're not going to look at those factors so much, but they will look at, think about what you're telling them, which is why you chose this university, why it was the right one for you.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. So one thing we haven't touched on during this conversation today is about family, and there's been a few questions about it. So mainly siblings. So I think the first one, this one is My sibling is also going on an F-1 visa for the same course. Should I mention it, or will it create difficulty for me to get the visa? One thing just to say before we answer any of these like more personal questions is we don't know the whole context of every single piece. So it's going to be hard to really give you unique personalized advice without knowing about your siblings, where they're going, what they're studying, where are you from, and the list goes on and on. But we can try to give at least some context and insights from Maggie's perspective. So Maggie, if you want to take it away.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think we do see a number of cases where siblings are studying in the United States, or they have studied, or that kind of thing. And I think one of the things that comes to mind as a former visa officer is, again, the financial aspect of this. How will your family cover the cost of, say, two people in a family studying in America? Where is that money coming from? So that is something that you would have to be prepared to clearly articulate to the visa officer. Your question, should I mention it? My advice always to people who are applying for visas is to be very open and honest, very transparent whenever you're asked anything by the visa officer. That is always going to put you in the best possible position. You never want to be get in trouble for misrepresentation or lying or fraud or anything like that. You want to be completely honest and transparent about that. And at the same time, you need to consider that you are the one applying for this visa, right? So you're talking about yourself mostly. So I think it really depends on the context. And I think there's no sort of black or white answer here for that. I think you want a majority talk about your own qualifications, because that's what anyone will need to do in order to try to be successful with the visa application. So I would keep an open mind to it. I think if it comes up, sure, discuss it, talk about how this makes sense for you and your family, et cetera. And sort of just see where the interview goes. I don't think there's a black or white answer here. But I definitely wouldn't try to hide it if they ask you. I think that's not a good way to go.
I think that's great advice. And one thing I think that's definitely out there is that people think that, okay, if I have family in the US, that's automatically a red flag for the visa interview. And it's not always the case. It really depends on, as Maggie was saying, explaining the questions about that family member. So maybe it has to do with funding, or maybe it has to do with the immigrant intent. There's going to be layers to each individual situation. It's not as simple as family in the US equals a refusal. I mean, even just this example and some of the other examples. So this one is about someone that has a citizen and a sister that's a citizen. This would be totally different advice. So I think, Maggie, how would you touch on people like that have family members that are permanent residents or citizens in the US, or have even other situations in the US?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that people should be prepared to discuss this. And, if they are asked about their family in America, be ready to talk about that. Be ready to say, these are my relatives who live there. This is their immigration status, and this is the jobs that they do, for example. So be very open and honest and very forthcoming about that, so that the visa officer doesn't feel like you have something to hide. I think that, again, this goes back to the whole point about the visa officer is considering your case from a 360-degree angle. They're looking at many, many different factors, not just one. So they will not necessarily, if they hear from you, oh, I have a sibling who's a US citizen, that's not an automatic refusal. That's just an information, part of your case. That's just information that you shared with them about your case. So I think that it's just something to think about, something to be open and honest about, be ready to discuss, and then also, know when it's time to bring it back to your own highlights about your own visa application, remembering that you have to demonstrate your qualifications.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. So we've talked about, a range of topics. One thing that we haven't talked about within the financial sector as much is about loans. And there have been a few questions about it. So one person asks, what are the chances of getting approved with an educational loan? And then there was another question shortly after about loans. So Maggie, I mean, how do the officers think about loans within this process?
I think that visa officers will think about loans in, maybe much the same way that when we were students ourselves, that many of us took student loans out, and it is quite a typical thing to do for a university student in America. One of the things they may be thinking about or asking about is, how will you pay back that loan? What is your plan? Or, is this a 100% loan? Is this a 50% loan? What is the wider context in terms of how you are covering the cost of your studies? So I think that's certainly a factor that they will look at. And I think if you're not really able to articulate your future career, future plans, how you're going to pay back this loan, et cetera, then that can be a negative thing for the visa officer sometimes.
Yeah, I think kind of this has been a continuous theme that one, it's something else you're going to have to be able to address, even if it's normal in the US, just because funding is a big component. And then there's layers to it, like there has been with every other topic throughout this conversation of how much is the loan? What are your plans? All those things Maggie touched on, and then again, more. So that's also why the personalized advice makes such a difference, because it's really hard to have just a one size fits all, because not only are things personal, but some advice we might give one person would be completely the opposite for you. And we don't want to do that through this kind of channel or format, because there's so many individual factors or layers that can really impact your interview. One question, Maggie, that's kind of a general tip, not specific to the student visa, but one thing we hear continuously is about one-word answers. And even earlier this week, I saw in a student visa interview Facebook group some advice about giving one-word answers, because it gives the officer less opportunities to refuse you, or less reasons to refuse you. I mean, what do you think about that advice of one-word answers, or the idea that the less you say, the less reasons the officer has to refuse you?
I think this is a big myth that I am ready to bust. I'm ready to bust this myth today for everyone. So I know that some people think this, and they think, oh, I just don't want to give them any reason to refuse me, so I'm going to just give them really, really short one-word answers. And what I would say to that is, I think that if you do that, then you're not taking advantage of the opportunity to explain yourself. So, you'll have a number of different factors, probably some positive ones, maybe some hurdles to overcome, but, you do have to tell the visa officer, show them that you are a genuine person, and you have to interact with them in a natural way. And so if you're only giving one-word answers, I would argue that you're not giving them enough information about yourself, enough good quality personal information about yourself in order to make a positive decision about your case. And, I think at the worst, it could come off as you're trying to hide something if you're not being very forthcoming, if you're only giving one-word answers. But I think at best, it just doesn't give speaking as a former visa officer, I'm trying to get as much information out of you as possible in the space of 2 or 3 minutes. And so the way that you can help me is you are very forthcoming with your answers, and you're giving me, good detailed answers. You're not going on and on. You're not being super long-winded, but you are giving me some good quality, clear, concise answers, say a couple sentences or so when I'm asking you a question. And then I'm feeling satisfied with the information that I'm getting. And it's all sort of hanging together for me. It's making sense. But I think if you just give one-word answers, that's really just not going to be enough information for the visa officer to make a decision. And if you haven't given the visa officer enough information, they're just going to refuse you. They do have that authority. So I would advise against that. I would say, don't do that. You need to share more of yourself. You need to really, let your personality shine through, be natural, be comfortable, be confident, and really let your personality shine through. And I think speaking as a former visa officer, that really, they can really respond positively to that if if you are, sharing your personality. And I think that's really difficult to do if you're giving extremely short one-word answers.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful context, Maggie. And hopefully too, from all the conversation that we've had so far, you would have an idea that that's probably not the best path, because we've recommended being proactive, taking advantage of the interview, all those things. But I think Maggie shared even more that it could come across as, like you're trying to hide something or you're missing out on so many opportunities. So there's a lot of reasons to not give one word answers. So thanks, Maggie, for sharing your advice. We are getting close to wrapping up on time, but we'll stay maybe 5 minutes over, since we started about 5 minutes late, if that's okay, Maggie, with your schedule.
Absolutely.
Great. So please ask your final questions. Just a reminder, please only send your question once. If you continue to send it, then we won't answer it, because it hides other people's questions. So it's just not fair to everybody else. Oh, and this was actually the question I wanted to go through. So let's talk about study gaps, because there's a handful of people that asked about study gaps. So again, right before we touch on this, Maggie, if you have questions that don't get answered, they might be really personal. And so if that's the case, we please recommend you reach out to us over email at hello@argovisa.com. So if you have a very specific question saying, this happened in my case, what does it mean? What does that mean? Please just send us an email. I'll send it in the chat. And again, we'll try to get through as many questions as possible in the next 5 or so minutes. So the first one is talking about study gaps, or just a gap in your journey. So how will the officer think about that?
Yeah. So I think that what they may ask about is, what's the reason for the study gap? What were you doing during that time? And so being ready and prepared to discuss that. For some people, that may make some sense, and then they decide to return to studying. I think it's all about, does this make sense to the visa officer, and how can you share your story in a way that makes sense? So, a 3 years gap, it's not going to be an automatic refusal. It's not an automatic approval. It's all how you explain it and how you give that context.
Awesome. Yeah. And just to touch on, this person had the same question. So I think that the same answer would apply. It really depends on your individual context. But again, kind of going back, it's another factor in your case. It's another piece that the officer is going to see in the DS-160, or something that is going to may be relevant to varying degrees depending on your whole 360. So I'm glad, Maggie, you brought up that concept of the 360 angle, because it just keeps coming back into play. So what do you think about dress code, or what to wear to the student visa interview?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, actually, from clients. So, I think overall, you're trying to create that positive first impression. So, you may think about, if you were going for a job interview, you'd want to look nice. You'd want to, you wouldn't wear things that were ripped jeans or, something like that. You would wear something that was nice. And I think as a student, or as an aspiring student, you're probably not going to be there in a 3-piece suit. I mean, that wouldn't make sense. So I always advise people, don't go out and buy anything brand new or expensive or too fancy. Don't do that. But also, think about, what the kind of impression you would like to create. So probably something that is, looks neat, looks somewhat business casual, look the part, basically. So if you're going to study in the US, how would you dress to convey that you're taking this seriously and you're going to do a good job with your studies and you've got a bright future ahead of you? So I don't think there's any one outfit that you should wear, but I think you should think about what is the best outfit for you that is going to convey that you're taking this seriously. So, certainly nothing that kind of, looks too overly casual. Don't wear flip flops and shorts like you would to the beach or something. And you use a bit of common sense. But I would say elevate your look if you can, but also don't go overboard. Don't go too formal, because that's probably not necessary for the student visa interview.
Awesome. And I think, Maggie, what you were just saying, it sounds very similar to the advice you had earlier about just communicating with the officer. You don't need to be so overly formal, saying sir and madam in every single sentence, but you also don't want to just use slang or inappropriate language also at the interview, because it's still a professional setting, or, a serious setting. So the last topic I want to cover, which is a little bit of a bigger one, is about home country ties. So this is, oftentimes on your refusal slip. If you get 214B, this might be on there. It's a mysterious topic with a lot of different potential meanings. We're trying to create more and more information about it, because I think some people think, okay, if I have this in my factor, this in my case, it is my home country tie, and then I'll get approved. But it's not always that simple. So just want to touch on a few things, Maggie, if you want to maybe explain a little bit of perspective on what home country ties are and why it's complicated, and then hit on a few questions related to it.
Absolutely. So when we think about ties to home country, what the visa officer is thinking about is, do you overcome 214B, which is that presumption of being an intending immigrant? And that is something that you will need to overcome during your interview. And the way that you do that is by demonstrating that you do have these strong ties to your home country. Now, what a visa officer thinks about when they think about ties can be a range of things. They can be family ties, they can be economic or professional ties to your home country. They could be, maybe you own some property, like a house or an apartment or some land, or maybe a business. That can also be considered ties. Financial ties in terms of where you earn your money, that may be considered as well. So there's a whole range of things, social or community ties. I mean, ties can mean a whole range of things. I think in the context of the visa interview, that's part of what the visa officer is asking you. They're trying to figure out, how strong are your ties to your home country, and do I think that you're going to return, after your trip or after your studies. So that is something that I think, in the context of the F-1 student visa applicant, how do you demonstrate that you have a plan after your studies to return to your home country? So for some people, they may be considering, I may be returning and maybe I'll get a promotion, or this is going to help me in my career, or I'm going to try to get a job in this industry with this company, et cetera. So if you have those kind of goals, that's great if you can articulate those to the visa officer. And that can be a way to demonstrate stronger ties to your home country. But it can be a little bit challenging to think about that. And it can be, it could certainly be helpful to work with Argo on this to help you, think about what are my ties to my home country, and how can I better articulate those during the interview, because that's definitely something that the visa officer will be asking you about.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and kind of what you said about articulating it and communicating it, because it's not as simple as checking a box, or even saying, "Oh yes, I have ties," or the officer isn't also looking, okay, has the applicant communicated their ties? Check. That's not how they're making a decision. It is more, again, back to the 360 angle, and back to the articulation and presentation and individual personal information all makes sense. And I think this is kind of an interesting question. How can you prove ties? I think Maggie kind of touched on it. Again, it's hard to give a 100% answer for everybody. But it is about using the opportunity of the interview to do so. But anything else on this topic before we wrap up, Maggie?
Just be prepared to be proactive. Even if you're not asked this question explicitly, you have to demonstrate it. So think about how you are able to do that. Think about the wording that you're going to use. Be proactive. Jump right in there with talking about what your home ties are, what your plan is for return, et cetera. And don't wait to be asked, because they might not ask you. You'll have to be very proactive and demonstrate that yourself through strong communication skills.
Awesome. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I didn't even plan to end on this question, but it does really connect a lot of the dots of what we have been talking about throughout this whole conversation about being proactive, having personal information, connecting with the officer, presentation, all of those components, the whole 360 angle. They all really relate to the home ties, especially when you're going for a non-immigrant visa like the student visa. So, we're at about an hour, so we'll be wrapping up. If you guys enjoyed the session today, be sure to comment and let us know that you liked it. So we'll do some more of these and plan for more in the future. We really appreciate Maggie taking some time out of her day to join us all and give her perspectives as a former consular officer, who, if you guys didn't hear at the beginning, she's made over 25,000 visa decisions throughout the world, also had experience working in Washington, D.C. And comment, share it with your friends. We'll love to see your support. And if we didn't get to your question, hopefully, again, we'll have more of these. Let us know if you'd like to do more of these sessions. And also send us an email. You can email us at hello@argovisa.com. I'll put this in the chat. And if you have any personal questions about your individual situation, your perspective, your last interviews, your upcoming interviews, all of that, just send us an email. And if you're interested in working with one of our officers directly, you can go on our website at I'll type it in the chat. It's easier. And you can book a session with one of our officers. And through the system, it will take into some of your factors into consideration and match you with the best officer on our team based on all of those factors, including when you want to do your consultation, your visa type, where you're applying, your language preferences. All of those things are considered in the booking process to get you with a great officer who will be able to help you. Like I said, our team has done over 1 million interviews. We have almost 20 officers. So there's a lot of different perspectives and experts on our team that can all bring a unique insight to your case. So thanks again, Maggie, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We hope to see you again soon. And yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to us over email or on our website. And good luck to everybody in your journeys. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you. Bye.